Hello there, what a wonderful journey has been as we continue with our adventure within the book of the Exodus. Have you really been learning something new? Well, I have, and as we delve deeper, I would want to crave your indulgence in this next episode called The Plagues. Ever heard of the Urios? Well, this is an opportunity to delve deeper. In ancient Egypt, religion wasn't a side note to power, it was its foundation. And unsurprisingly, pharaohs weren't seeing themselves as kings, they were living gods, at least per their own narrative. They saw themselves as direct representatives of the divine on earth. Every structure of Egyptian life, from politics and agriculture to medicine to birth, was governed by a pantheon of gods, numbering in the hundreds. Can you believe that? And these gods were said to control the sun, the Nile, fertility, disease, and even death itself. Amongst the most striking symbols of divine authority was what is known as Uraeus, Uraeus, and it is the upright cobra mounted on the pharaoh's crown. This snake represented the god Wajeh, the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt, who is believed to spit fire upon enemies and guard the ruler with supernatural force. With this, Pharaoh was more than a mortal, at least according to them. He was the divine enforcer of the cosmic order. But here is the twist. When Moses and Aaron stepped into Pharaoh's court, bearing a message from Yahweh, the God of Israel, they weren't just making a political demand, they were triggering a divine confrontation. And this is what is written according to the 12th chapter and the 12th verse of the second book of Moses. Against all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. This was not just a series of natural disasters. It was, in fact, a systematic dismantling of Egypt's spiritual hierarchy. One by one, Yahweh would confront their gods in their respective domains and reveal how powerless they were before him. And so it began with a serpent. Like we always do, we go through well laid down procedures as we discover the important facts we are looking at. We will discover the prelude, as already said, where we'll look at the snake fight, the hardened heart, then quickly look into the plagues. Not just any plagues, but the first three mild plagues, then proceed to the three serious plagues, then finally the three devastating plagues. Very important for our discourse. Let's proceed then. The prelude. What do we see here? If I may ask, what would you think could be the motivator for a duel between God himself and the gods of Egypt? It shows you how significant this sojourn of Moses was. On Pharaoh's head, as we have discovered, the cobra of Wajeh symbolized invisibility and divine protection. And it's no surprise that it was indeed a snake fight. When Aaron cast down the staff and it became a serpent, merely Yahweh was confronting this royal and divine protector head on. And you know, per the story, Egyptian magicians mimicked the miracle, but could not match its power. Aaron's serpent devoured theirs, and through this, God showed that his authority superseded not only pharaohs, but the gods of Egypt themselves. What a duel it was! God himself directly against the God who is known to be the cobra goddess. It doesn't end there. Continuing It appears that this mere depiction of divine authority and divine power pricks the heart of Pharaoh. And that is why we see a hardened heart displayed by this monarch. Pharaoh's resistance was spiritual as much as it was political. And it is no surprise that we see recorded in the books. Of course, we are looking at the Pentateuch, especially with focus on Exodus. The Bible records 18 different instances of Pharaoh's heart being hardened. 9 times by Pharaoh himself, then the other 9 said by God. But after the 6th plague, we see God's intervention reveals Pharaoh had crossed the line of willful rebellion. In a nutshell, God's mercy offered space for repentance, but Pharaoh rejected. This was some hard hearts that this guy had. And of course, as you would expect, the plagues would now follow. I would want you to pay a very important and critical attention to this part of this episode. The first plague, which at least looking at the magnitude of the plagues that followed, it was mild. This was what was done, and we see, according to Egyptology, looking at the gods of Egypt, Hapi was the god of the Nile, and in direct contravention to the power of this god, Yahweh turned the Nile and all rivers into blood. According to the record of Exodus 7, the Nile with its floods, which gave life to Egypt. In fact, it watered the various farms and the ecosystem of Egypt. But in this particular point in time, they were all turned to blood, posing a very important question. Who created the source of water? Is it the magicians or God himself? Well, it is God himself. So the magicians, in a way to redeem themselves, simulated the transformation of the water. But as we all discover, they could not reverse this problem. It doesn't end there. The second plague, as we see, is recorded to be also mild. What happens here? The second plague is where we see frogs. Yes, frogs. And we are told, according to the Exodus account, that Aaron stretched out his hand with a staff over the streams and the canals and the ponds, and frogs came up on the land of Egypt. Well, there is another god called Heket, and this particular god happens to have the head of a frog. In Egyptology, at least in the annals of Egyptian history, this particular god was in charge of very important streams, very important canals and ponds in Egypt, quite similar to the first god. And again, the magicians tried to imitate this plague, but were unable to stop it. It doesn't end there. The duel gets more complicated. In the third one, which again is seen as a mild one, Yahweh introduced the lice, and that was in direct contravention, in direct opposition to the power of this god called Geb, who in Egypt was known or is known as a god of the earth. It is very clear, according to the records of Genesis, that it is only Yahweh who accepts the responsibility and the originator of creation. So here, by implementing lice or bringing lice through dust of the ground, God was directly, in this case Yahweh, was directly asking the question, who can create? In fact, he created life from the dust of the ground, and there was no longer any doubt about the origin of the plagues. This, as someone exclaimed, is the finger of God. Now, the magicians fell silent. Let's get deeper. It appears Pharaoh's heart was still hardened, so God intensifies the plagues. The next set of animals to come into the scene were the flies. Well, there is this goddess of marshes, Uwachet, and this particular goddess was seen being represented by a fly. For the first time, the Israelites were protected from the plague, and this sort of clarifies the consequence of Pharaoh hardening his heart after the first 3 plagues. In this case, the action of Pharaoh had now given God the opportunity to fully separate the Israelites and the Egyptians. In this case, the sufferer or the sufferers were the Egyptians. And this led Pharaoh to ultimately, first of all, bargain, but unfortunately, never repented, necessitating the significance of a more serious plague, the death of the cattle. Have you ever heard the god Kum? Well, he is known to be the creator god in Egypt, or at least in the context of old Egypt mythology. It is perfectly understood that many gods in Egypt had animal heads. So this particular plague was a humiliation to most of them. But after that, due to the frequent hardness of Pharaoh's heart, the plagues got more serious. Ulcers were now the turn of the day. According to the records of Exodus chapter 9 verse 10, they took soot from a furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Then Moses did this particular one himself. He tossed it into the air, and festering boils broke out on people and animals. A direct rebuke to the goddess of healing. In this way, Yahweh posed this question: can you heal your people? A question to the goddess of healing, Sekhmet. Not even the magicians could heal themselves, and Pharaoh had no doubt about the source of the plagues. But as we have usually seen, he decided to refuse to bow down. And of course, God Yahweh doesn't force. He allowed him to reap the fruit of his rebellion in the 7th plague. Now, this is very devastating. Assuming you are walking around in the streets of the city wherein you live, and all of a sudden you hear and see hail falling from heaven, probably you may want to wonder, what is even the size of hail? Well, it can be very heavy. At least from current meteorological studies. And in this case, in this particular narrative, we see that at this time of the morrow, as recorded in Exodus 9, I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt, from the day it was founded till now. In other words, this was a direct rebuke to the goddess of the sky, Nut, and Set, who happens to be the god of storms. This particular hail was not only limited to heavier things falling, but came with a storm. In this particular time, the faith of the Egyptians were tested. In fact, those who believed saved the lives of their servants and their livestock. But Pharaoh, well, unfortunately, continued in his hardness. You were expecting a more devastating plague, and that is what the 8th plague gave us. Neper, who happens to be the god of grain, was seen as the supplier of all the needs in terms of the cereals, the grains, and the legumes of Egypt. By this introduction of the locusts, Neper was directly antagonized. In fact, he was being questioned with regards to his sovereignty, even if he existed or not. With Egypt devastated, the Egyptians themselves were now pricked to beg Pharaoh to let Israel go. Unfortunately, this man, as we see, is not ready. And the ninth plague, which was in direct contravention to Ra, the god of the sun, in other words, the father of all the gods of Egypt, was now ultimately being questioned. God, in this way, was asking, "You are deemed the god of the sun. Now, I, who happens to be the perpetrator and the creator of light, have taken my light. What can you do?" And as we all know, the sun happens to be the ultimate producer of energy, not only in the context of light, but various mechanisms that propel life on earth. Life in Egypt came to a standstill for 3 days, but more miraculously, Israelites within Goshen had light. And in this period of 3 days of waiting, reminiscent of the 3 days of waiting which we have seen consistently in various parts of the Bible, like the 3 days in the belly of the fish during Jonah's sojourn, God granted a time of reflection, which Pharaoh did not take full advantage of. Again, he moved God to do the worst. The question is, what will happen next? And that is something which I believe you have an answer to. But basically, the whole idea and narrative, the didactic of the story, appears that historically and even concurrently in our current sojourn, there has never been any other name under heaven given to men by which we can be saved. Omnipotence belongs to one alone.